About the change in covenants, lesson number 4. All right, so let's go to Jeremiah 31. That's where we finished our class on Sunday, and let's refresh ourselves and refresh our minds as to where we were then, and then we will get into the New Testament in just a moment. Jeremiah chapter 31. So when Jeremiah makes this prophecy about God bringing about a new covenant, I'm not sure Jeremiah knew the significance of what he was saying. But this section, this prophecy, really is Jeremiah's greatest contribution to the gospel and the new covenant that Jesus is going to bring about. So in verse 31 of chapter 31, the prophet says, "Behold, days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah. Not like the covenant which I made with their fathers in the day that I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt, my covenant which they broke, although I was a husband to them, declares the Lord. This is the covenant which I will make with the house of Israel after those days, declares the Lord. I will put my law within them, and on their heart I will write it, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. They will not teach again each man his neighbor and each man his brother, saying, Know the Lord, for they will all know me, from the least of them to the greatest of them, for I will forgive their iniquity, and their sin I will remember no more." Now, let's just remember a few of the things that we said on Sunday. For those of you that needed a handout, would you raise your hand up nice and high so Arlie can come and find you? Down here in the front, we got a couple. All right. Let's remember some of the things that we said on Sunday. What do you remember from our discussion of this passage Sunday? Oh boy. All right, everybody. Come on. What do you remember? What were some of the expressions, the phrases we talked about? What were some of the points we made? Joe?
That in the kingdom, the new kingdom, it's a prerequisite to be in the kingdom of God, and that in the old covenant you were born into.
Okay, good. So, under the first covenant, you were born into that covenant by virtue of your lineage going back to Abraham. You were born a Jew. And you were born into that covenant as a Jew, and then you would be taught the law of the Jews, right? You enter into the covenant, and then you're taught. But that's not the way it's going to be with the new covenant. With the gospel, you are taught first, and then you make a decision, and then you enter into the covenant. So that's an interesting and important difference between the two. What else did we talk about Sunday?
The covenant is based in blood.
All right, can you elaborate that?
God's going to consecrate it with blood, and He's going to spread blood on the people.
All right. But, okay, what was that last expression you just said, Dad?
He's going to spread the blood upon the people.
Just like He did in the Old Covenant, right? Yeah, in Exodus 24, the first covenant made at Sinai was ratified, and Moses sprinkled blood on the people. I always thought that was kind of an interesting story. Like, how would you feel if that was happening to you? But this new covenant will also be instituted with blood, but whose blood? What's significant about this blood? Yeah, of course, this is an entirely different sacrifice that's being offered. Okay, good. All right, anything else? Okay, Joe? Okay, and we talked about this on Sunday. His comment was that God's word would be in their hearts. Was that not supposed to be true under the first covenant? Yeah. You remember Moses in Deuteronomy 6? He said, "These words that I command you today shall be in your heart," right? It was supposed to happen under the first covenant, but it will happen under the new covenant.
So what happened to the heart of Israel? Turned to what? Yes, but I think we talked about what God said through Ezekiel. What did God say the heart of Israel was like?
It turned into stone.
Stone.
Right.
It turned into stone. So.
And what's going to happen? What does Ezekiel say? They're going to receive, in the new Messianic age, they're going to receive a heart of flesh, one that's soft, one that's receptive to the things that God has to say. All right. Jeremiah speaks about a covenant that will come in the future. Okay? Behold, the days are coming when I will do this. You see the future element of this. Well, let's go to Hebrews chapter 8. Hebrews chapter 8. Because this passage in Jeremiah is quoted here. In Hebrews 8, let's start reading at verse 6. Talking about the Lord, it says, "But now he has obtained a more excellent ministry, inasmuch as he is also mediator of a better covenant, which was enacted on better promises. For if that first covenant had been faultless, then no place would have been sought for a second. Because finding fault with them, he says, Behold, the days are coming when I will make a new covenant with the..." All right, do you see in your Bible, that does the font look different? Is it in quotation marks? Do you see that verse 8 down through verse 12 are a quotation? And that's a quotation from Jeremiah 31, verses 31 to 34. Now, we're not going to read through that again. We've already read it. But notice what was said about Jesus in verse 6. He is the mediator of a better covenant, which was established on better promises. All right. So the Hebrew writer then, quoting from Jeremiah 31, he tells us that the new covenant that Jeremiah spoke of is now in effect. The Hebrew writer is looking back at what Jeremiah said and saying, and now the new covenant that Jeremiah spoke of is here. You see that, Alan?
And verse 13.
Yeah, I'm getting there. Yes. All right, you with me? You see what the Hebrew writer is doing? Okay.
And why would all of these points be significant to the Jews? I mean, here there's a new mediator. Who was the mediator of a covenant? The first covenant. Who was the mediator of that? Moses. You know, Moses was, but now there's a new mediator. And that first covenant, you know, well, it was that. It was a covenant. It was an agreement. It was a promise from God to those who were his people. But this is a better covenant. And that first covenant offered promises. There were promises with that first covenant. But this covenant offers better promises. All of that there in that couple of verses, see?
Yep. Okay, so let's close with verse 13. In that he says, a new covenant. Okay. When God said a new covenant, when he said that through Jeremiah, back in Jeremiah 31, the effect of that is he has made the first obsolete. Now, what is becoming obsolete is growing old and ready to vanish away. What is it that's becoming obsolete? It's growing old. It's ready to vanish away. Yeah, the covenant of Moses, right? A new one is coming. The best illustration that I can give you with this, and it's not original with me, I wish it was, because this is such a helpful illustration. So you're driving your car. You start to hear a noise. Uh-oh, that doesn't sound good. You take it to the mechanic, and he says, you need an entire new transmission. It's going to cost thousands of dollars to get this fixed. And with a car this old, you might as well just look at replacing this. So you come home and you say to your spouse, I think it's time to buy a new car. And you start talking about that. Well, what kind of car should we get? And do we do a van or a truck or a sedan or Tesla or a Chevy or whatever? You start talking through all of these different things. We got to get a new car. We got to get a new car. We got to get a new car. What's happened to your current car that has the transmission problems? It's now the old car. Right? From the moment you said, I think we need to buy a new car, your current car began growing old, was vanishing away, and is ready to become obsolete. You follow me? It's going to be replaced. It hasn't happened yet, but it's going to. It's inevitable. And now, every conversation that you have with your spouse about vehicles, wait, you talking about the new car or the old car, right? You've done that. You talking about the new covenant or the old covenant? Joe?
Just to clarify, so you're saying, when he says, in that he says a new covenant, he has made the first obsolete, he's talking, referencing when he said it back then.
Yeah. When did the old covenant of Moses become old? From the moment Jeremiah said, a new covenant is coming one day. It was still in effect when Jeremiah said that, right? But the fact that he said, we need to get a new car, it meant the current car was growing old and was ready to vanish away. You follow me? All right, yes, sir.
What made this difficult for me in looking at this in the last week is that Paul would talk about the promise that God made to Abraham, that in him all nations would be blessed through his seed, and he talked about Jesus. And then he uses the word covenant to talk about that promise, which was ratified before the Mosaic law. And that made it difficult for me because he says this covenant, talking about the promise that God made to Abraham, was ratified 430 years before the law.
Okay, yeah, you're talking about Galatians,
Yeah,
right?
And that made and like, yeah, Jeremiah says new covenant. And so to me it sounds like there's a distinction to be made between a covenant when it's inaugurated, which is explicitly in Jesus' death in Hebrews 9. And when it was ratified, Paul uses the language that there was a covenant associated with the promise that God made to Abraham, and its ratification came before the law in Galatians 3:17.
Well, yeah, but in Galatians, he's talking about the promise made to Abraham and then the law which came later, and that even though there was this law that came later, it didn't trump or nullify what he had already promised to Abraham, right? So he's still working out the promises to Abraham, and he's doing that through national Israel, who had a law, who had a covenant that was different but related. Does that...
So you associate, what throws a wrench in it for me is when he uses covenant. So it's like, is there a third covenant, the one he made with Abraham, or do you associate that one with the one we have now? That made the one, the new covenant, Jeremiah's new covenant. Is that different than the covenant that Paul associated with the promise made to Abraham? Sorry, maybe this can happen later.
No, it's okay.
But verse 16 in that same passage uses the word promises that were made to Abraham. And I think it's just a different word in verse 17.
Yeah.
The promise is a covenant. When you make a promise with someone, you have established
A covenant.
that there are two parties to that and they have an agreement. And so I think it's just a change of words, but it's talking about the same event when it was made to Abraham, even though there's going to be something in between before the fulfillment of the one that would bless all the nations of the earth.
What makes it difficult too is because there's two women that he'll talk about as an analogy to these two, right? Hagar and Sarah, and properties of the covenant. The one with Sarah, which is supposed to be analogous to ours, is the promise. So the promise seems to be a property of the covenant, whereas working out things through the actions, works of flesh is the property of, right? That's how Abraham tried to accomplish the promise
But you're on to a good point there, and the parallel being Hagar is Sinai and Moses, and it's not sufficient, and so it needs to be done away with so that the promise that was made to Sarah or Abraham can continue on as God intended. Matt?
To be clear, too, there isn't only two covenants in the Bible, the Old and the New.
Right.
There's
There's tons of them, yeah. David had one, yeah.
There's covenants to other people.
Sure.
Covenant with Abraham, according to what Paul is saying, there's a covenant with Abraham. In Genesis 12, we don't always refer to it that way. We talk about the land, promise, seed, promise, sake, but it starts out by saying, if you do this, then I will do this. That's a covenant, not just a promise, right? We know that Abraham did leave his land, but it doesn't mean that, like in Deuteronomy 5, I think, when Moses said, he didn't make this covenant with them, he made it with us, meaning this new generation. This covenant, Abraham's covenant certainly was a lead-in to the covenant that he made with all of Israel, but it was just a small part of that. Then it came into more of a fruition with the law of Moses and completion, and then sprinkling of the blood, and here we are, out in Mount Sinai and everything else. So I do think there's a growth to it, but then constantly looking, starting especially with Jeremiah, but from Abraham, all nations, meaning not just Israel. So it is also part of the new covenant. That promise is part of the new covenant for us as well, because we're the all nations, not just Israel.
David?
I'm not sure this is exactly relevant to the previous point, but it is correct. In Galatians 3, Paul makes the argument that the law coming in did not nullify what had happened 430 years earlier.
Right, with Abraham.
And he said it was previously ratified by God, that it would be by promise and not by the law. And he makes a distinction of something being by promise or being by the law. But it says in Hebrews 9, which you're looking at earlier, the promise can't come to fruition until the death of the one through whom that would come, and makes that argument. The will is not in effect until the death occurs. So yes, it had been ratified, but there's almost a juxtaposition between the first covenant is made to Abraham, with Abraham, ratified by God, but it's a promise that's going to take hundreds of years. And so the first covenant, in a way, is almost like covenant 1A.
So let's wrap it up with this, and maybe I don't know if this discussion's been helpful. If not, we can talk some more. But this covenant that God made with Abram in Genesis 12 was made before he became a Jew, right? Circumcision and that promise and that whole development doesn't come until Genesis 17. So when this promise was made to him, Abraham was a Gentile, right? That's what Paul says in Romans 4. This came when he was a Gentile. And the thrust of that being, there is an overarching promise to the story that God is developing that includes not just Israel, but everyone. And it even began with this non-Israelite man, Abraham.
And I wonder if we would look at the law of Moses as that which was put in place to help fulfill the promise that was first made, to Abraham. That's what God used to bring his people closer and to bring us to Christ. When we get to Galatians chapter 3, the latter part, we come to understand more the purpose of the law, which was to bring us to Christ. But that's getting a little ahead of the game right there. And if we go back here just to the idea of what we're seeing in Hebrews chapter 10, chapter 9, chapter 8, this idea that, what the writer is saying in Hebrews is that law that was delivered through Moses has come to an end. And where were we at? Did you, in chapter 8, verse 13, I don't think we read, it was like...
Yeah, we did.
Okay, yeah, okay.
Remember the car illustration?
Oh, yeah, that's right.
The new car and the old car?
Oh, yeah, that. That the first has become obsolete. That law is no more. That has gone away. And I think this is a key point for us to consider and to think about and kind of really have an understanding of. That law is no more. that when a new law comes, the first law goes away. And my illustration, taking this to the next point here, and some of you in the class that was downstairs, you've already heard this, but it's like when you're driving on the road out here in front of the church building, and let's say the speed limit was 40 miles an hour. And that's what we get used to driving on that road. Of course, most people drive at 40 miles an hour anyway.
Yeah, it's only 30.
And it's 30.
Yeah.
But then it changes to 30. Now, a police officer pulls us over and says, you're going too fast. The speed limit's 30 now. And you say, well, it used to be 40. Well, what does that mean? Nothing. It used to be 40, but it's not now, because there's a new law that's been put in place. And the new law makes the old law obsolete. It's no more. And that's what the writer is saying here. And while for many of us we think like, oh yeah, okay, I get that right, let's move on. Let's understand, a lot of people don't get that point. We were talking about Sunday, or maybe it was last Wednesday, I don't remember, how many churches, Protestant religions today, will turn to the Old Testament to try to justify what they do in religion. They'll look at different passages there and pick out this and that to try to justify what they do in religion. They go to a law that has been superseded, a law that is obsolete, a law that has come to an end.
And for the vast majority of them, a law that they were never under to begin with.
Yeah, that's right. A law that was a written law given to whom? Israel, to the Jews. It was specific to the Jews. And so this new law, as we've talked about, is a law that has come and has been given to all men. So we need to see some of those differences. But if we look at a couple of other passages here in Hebrew that I think are helpful, maybe just to kind of bolster some points that have already been made, look at chapter 10 real quick here. We'll just read through this quickly. Chapter 9, I just want you to think about and know where some of these passages are at. That Paul repeats. I mean, if we're repeating some points, it's because Paul did it first. And I think there's got to be a reason. The book of Hebrews is so interesting that chapter by chapter, in so many ways, Paul says the same thing over and over. Now, different points are analogies, but have you noticed that? I mean, like Paul repeats himself a lot. Don't you wonder why? Because there were some problems understanding this. It was because there were those Jewish Christians that were struggling to understand that the law has been put to the side. Chapter 10.
My book of Hebrews doesn't say Paul wrote it.
I'm sorry.
I was checking to see
Why
if
do I
yours-
keep saying
I don't know.
Paul?
I was just checking to see if yours did.
We don't know. We wrote Hebrews. Forget the Paul part. I'm thinking the Galatians, where we're going in a moment. Chapter 10, in verse 9, when it says, Then he said, Behold, I have come to do your will, O God. He takes away the first that he may establish the second. By that will we have been sanctified through the offering of the body of Jesus Christ once for all. Again, just emphasizing the first law is no more. Here is a law that's been brought to us and sanctified through Jesus Christ. Back up just a little bit, chapter 9. Maybe it's the same page for you there. Look at chapter 9. And the question for us to think about is, what does the new covenant represent? I think we get an answer here. We're stepping into a context that is so very much talking about the sacrifice of Jesus and what that is, what it offers to us. We're taking up in verse 15. And for this reason, he is the mediator of the new covenant. The he is Christ in the context. And here again, the emphasis on being a mediator. The Jews would have so very well known and understood Moses as being the mediator of that old covenant. But it is no more. And now Christ is the one who is the mediator of this new covenant by means of death for the redemption of the transgressions under the first covenant, that those who are called may receive the promise of the eternal inheritance. For where there is a testament, there must also of necessity be the death of the testator. For a testament is in force after men are dead, since it has no power at all while the testator lives. Now tell me, what does that mean? What is that about? What's the writer trying to tell us? Tell me. The will. Yeah, we think, well, we might say someone has written their last will and testament. You know, if we want some things clear when we die from this life, or some things that we want to happen or to be done when this life comes to an end, we write a will, a testament. But what good is that paper if we're still alive? What does that paper mean?
There's a promise there,
There's a promise.
but it cannot be enforced.
It can't be enforced. It's not in effect yet. It can't be carried out until the testator dies. And we get that. We understand how that works. And is this any different? This is not any different. So there was a promise of a new law. There was a promise of a new covenant. But it was just that. It was a promise. And it could not come into effect until the old covenant was no more, till the testator died. In this case, in this context, it's talking about Christ right here, a testament that was delivered from the sacrifice or by the sacrifice of Jesus. Moses was that mediator of the old. Jesus is the mediator of the new. And there must be a death for the testament to come into effect. Now, your thoughts, comments you would have about that, questions. And so what I hope is just so very clear is that that old covenant has become null and void. It is no more because the new covenant is in place. Joe?
Something you said last week, I just think is so helpful. It's just
A little bit louder, Joe.
something that you said last week that I found really helpful is just understanding that the Gospels take place under the Old Covenant and under the Old Law, and the death of Christ is that's where the critical
Okay.
time where everything changes. And
Right.
that's a critical, really important thing to understand.
Oh, okay, just the point again that how long was that old covenant in effect? Sometimes I hear people say, well, you know, when the Old Testament comes to an end, you know, we start the New Testament, we're in the new covenant. And I don't think so. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the life and times of Jesus, those who lived in, they were still under the old covenant. It was still in effect. Jesus, you know, someone said to me not too long ago, you know, Jesus was the best Christian there ever was. Well, no, he was.
I can't argue with that.
You know, he was a good Jew, but not a Christian. They were still under that old law, right? And you see, this is what I'm saying. So often we don't understand the distinction between the covenants and when one ends and when another one begins. And so then the question that comes up, and I think we have to talk about taking us into Galatians chapter 3. So then, if God knew there was going to be a need of a new covenant, which he obviously knew because he foretold it hundreds of years before, why did he even have the old covenant? Like, what was the reason? What was the purpose of that? Why did he put the Jews through all that was involved in the old covenant if he knew that in the end he was going to bring about and establish a new? There has to be a reason.
The Old Testament proves Jesus is who he says he is.
Okay, the Old Testament proves that Jesus is who he says he
I
is.
think there's a lot of answers to this
I do
question.
too.
That's
I do
one
too.
of them.
Prophecies
Yeah.
are
I,
fulfilled in
Prophecies that were spoken are fulfilled. So what does that do for us?
when Jesus comes and says, I am the Christ, there's justification firstly is coming because we see prophecy fulfilled in
Right,
Christ.
right.
He is what was promised to come.
He is the fulfillment of those prophecies. And what I saw another hand somewhere here. Yes?
So through Hebrews 8, 9, and 10, it reminds us the old covenant provided a temporary means for the Hebrew sins to be forgiven,
Okay.
but it was not a permanent forgiveness.
Okay.
They just roll back from year to year with the sacrifices. Through Christ's blood, we have a permanent forgiveness of our sins once we
So,
believe the gospel.
in that Old Testament, in the Old Covenant, we learn something. Well, number one, we learn something about sin. Paul would say in Romans, I think in chapter 5, that he says, well, how would I have known sin were it not for the law? It helped us to see and identify what sin was. It helped us to see and identify the need of forgiveness of sin. And that forgiveness came at a cost. There was sacrifice always. Sacrifice after sacrifice after sacrifice, for the atonement of the Jews. But also helps us to see and to identify the precious sacrifice of Christ, a sacrifice given and offered one time for all, a sacrifice that in fact does take away sins. Remember back to Jeremiah 23, Jeremiah 31, when God through Jeremiah said, and I will remember their sins no more. Well, how could he do that? Because under that old law, sacrifice was more or less, atonement brought about a remembrance of sin, the writer says in the Hebrew letter. There's something different with this new covenant where there's this hope of forgiveness of sin, where God remembers our sins no more. And so we're still kind of working through this idea then of trying to understand, so why the law? I mean, why didn't God just go to the new law at the beginning?
I think he did it to separate the Israelites from other nations.
There's this, right?
They're the ones that broke the covenant
Right.
over and over again.
Mhm.
To be like other nations.
Okay.
I think that was, God definitely knew that was going to happen, but again, it ties into what Alan said, to prove the lineage, to bring it down to Abraham and David.
So, it has been said, I don't think there's one answer to the question. There are a number of answers to the question, but I'm hoping that we are seeing and kind of getting a flavor of God's overall purpose, why there was that first covenant, and then why there was a second. Let's go to Galatians chapter 3. Turn to Galatians chapter 3. David?
You alluded to this a minute ago in Romans 7 and then on into 8. Paul talks about he wouldn't even know their sins except that the commandments were there.
Right.
He would know about coveting except the commandment said, you shall not covet.
Yes.
I think that then extending that, the overall purpose was to show, and Paul talks about this a lot, that you cannot achieve salvation through law keeping.
Yeah, right. Because we can't keep the law perfectly.
Right. And so that's a major purpose of the law, to teach people a lesson.
So then it still brings us back to then what was the purpose of the law? And that's not just our question. It's not original with us. Because you think of how much Paul had to say about these very issues, these very questions, and in fact, he asked that question.
So can we look, before you go to the chapter 3,
Okay.
let's look at Galatians 5, because Paul makes this very point that David just made. Galatians 5 and verse 3, I testify again to every man who becomes circumcised. I want you to read there, who commits to being a Jew, okay? Represented by circumcision, but to every person who commits to being a Jew, that he is a debtor to do what? Keep the whole law. Couple things. To try and no. He's obligated to keep it. Not just try to keep it, but to do it. Because once he breaks it,
Yeah.
his goose is cooked. He's a lawbreaker. He's a sinner. So you are obligated to keep just a portion of, no, the whole thing. All the commands. And all of these millions of Jews who lived throughout the centuries who tried to do that, what did they all learn? I can't do it. Now, Joe, make your point.
Okay. Alan?
Well, I think the question of why God did it the way that he did is really secondary to the fact that there's a connection, though, between the old law and the new law. And that is, it is the cross of Christ. That is the pivotal point for both the old and the new. The blood of Christ flows both directions. It covers the people in the old law, it covers the people in the new law. And so, why get too hung up on the fact that there is absolutely no connection between the two, because there is.
There is. And I wouldn't want to think that there's no connection between the two, because there most certainly is. And in fact, in chapter 9, verse 15, where we read a few moments ago, I think that's a passage that helps to give some inclination there to the idea and the fact that the blood of Jesus flows both ways, as you said, and provides for those who, under the old law, had to offer sacrifice after sacrifice after sacrifice. But now there is the blood of Christ that cleanses. And so I think that's a point of not just interest, but significance that we would need to think about and consider. I don't think we're going to really get into this Galatians chapter 3. We're not going to have time for that. But just some thoughts here as we're closing up. So we're trying to work our way through an understanding of why the old law and why the new law. And I think there's some clear reasons why there was a reason, there was a purpose for that. And I think we can understand it. But I want us to think back to first century for just a little while. And think of how many times in the epistles and in the book of Hebrews that this is the topic of discussion. That this is what's being talked about by the Apostle Paul, by the Apostle Peter, by the writer of Hebrews. Do we see and understand this, how difficult it was for the Jews of that time, even those who have come to Christ and become disciples of Christ, that they are struggling to understand that, no, they're not really under the old law. They saw and they understand we need Jesus. He was the one that was prophesied of. This is the fulfillment of things God said before. And yet there seems to be that there was some effort by some of saying, okay, that's fine that you're a Christian, you're a baptized believer, but you have to keep the law too. And so I want us to appreciate how difficult it would have been if we were raised as a Jew. And for generations, our fathers have been raised and been taught as a Jew, that all of a sudden it's kind of like a little bit hard to understand some of the changes now that's happening or taking place.
Mm-hmm. It would, just to say, it's hard to erase 1,500 years of history like that.
It would be. Now, if there was a full appreciation of the prophecies and all that was said pertaining to the coming of Christ in a new covenant, I want to think it's like, well, man, they should have got that. But I learn more and more as time goes on. I'm a little bit less critical of some of those that didn't get it real quick, because some of you know and have learned very well with me. I don't always get it. And I'm sometimes the slowest one, it seems, to get some things. But when we look at some of these passages in Hebrews, and next is Galatians that we're going to, I hope we do get it. I mean, we have the benefit of hindsight. We have the benefit of the full revelation given to us. And where I think we can understand, well, that old covenant has come to an end. It was Christ who brought it to an end when he nailed the old law to the cross. But that doesn't take away the significance of the old law, not at all. God had a reason and a purpose for that old law. It is important, it's significant, and we don't need to take anything away from that. Now, what I want you to do for Sunday is this text on your outline, Galatians chapter 3, beginning in verse 24. Actually, we're going to begin in verse 21. I really wish you'd read that over. And the Ephesians 2 and the Colossians 2 passage, I don't want to spend a lot of time on this on Sunday, because we've worked this out a lot. But there are some key points here in these passages that I really want us to make and I want us to understand. So we're going to spend some time there Sunday, God willing. I want you to look at that, please. Spend some time with that and pick up lesson number 5, because we'll look at getting into that as well. So glad you're here tonight. Thank you.